This is Lecture 1 of Psychology 230, Introduction to Brain and Behavior, and it corresponds to Chapter 1 of your textbook. So some quick introductions before I get into the lecture material. My name is Mallory Klonig. You can refer to me as Dr. Klonig or Dr. Mallory. You can contact me through email as the best way to get a hold of me. Here's my email address, and as well you can find this on the syllabus or the front page of LaLima. My office hours are by appointment, and we can talk over like the chat function in Google Hangout. We can talk over video in Google Hangout, or I'm also going to start using Zoom. So if that's your preference, we can use that. I am working from the East Coast of the US for the summer, so I'm 6 hours ahead of Hawaii, but we can certainly work some things out. I work more into the evenings often, so I have flexible hours. If you do email me, I always aim to respond to your emails within 48 weekday hours. I can't always guarantee a response on weekends or holidays. That said, please don't hesitate to contact me. It's my job to help you. A little bit about my background. My master's work was in neurocognitive psychology at the University of Munich in Germany. And then second master's is in clinical psych, and then PhDs in clinical psych from UH Manoa. My specific areas of interest, which also overlap with my clinical work. So I work as a clinical psychologist too, doing like therapy and assessment with people with psychological issues. But a lot of my research has been in neurobiology of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, predicting and preventing psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, transdiagnostic approaches on mental illness. And I also have a specialty interest in mental illness in sub-Saharan African regions and other low-resource areas of the world. So please do look over the syllabus for this class, but I'll give you kind of some of the highlights as well. Each week you're going to do readings from the required textbook. And then you can either watch the lecture on our YouTube channel or listen to the lecture, which will be the lecture's recorded over the PowerPoints always. So if you click in that little like speaker button in the bottom right corner, you can of each slide, you can listen to the lecture that way. And please let me know if you have any questions about that. Every week, the homework assignment will be due Sunday at 11 p.m. Anything after 11 p.m. is considered late. Some weeks you'll also have an exam due at the same time, but you can complete the exam anytime during the week before. So I release the exam on Monday, and you have any usually 1.5 hour time period to complete the exam, and I'll give you more information about that when we do get to the first exam. Again, really absolutely contact me if you're unclear about any information on the syllabus. Although, small caveat, please do read the syllabus carefully before contacting me, just to make sure it's not already, your question's already answered in there. And then as well, the syllabus is subject to change. So I do a little poll in the first homework every week to get a better sense of what you and your course mates are interested in, what your priorities are in this course. And where I can, I like to adjust the course material a bit. So there may be some chapters that we focus a little bit more on. There may be even chapters that we drop if I don't think they're completely necessary to the course and there isn't a lot of interest within the class. But I will always update you and let you know via LaLima if the syllabus has changed. In general, I follow the structure of the book. So in general, like lecture 1 is going to cover like most of the material from the first chapter of the textbook. There are definitely exceptions. Lectures will be pretty brief compared to an in-person class session, and so it won't be maybe if classes that last like 50 minutes. The lectures will usually be, I think, between like 30 minutes, sometimes up to 60 minutes. Lectures material trumps book material. So if a topic is framed differently in the lectures, my lectures as compared to the book, the lecture material is what you should defer to. However, it is still important to read the textbook. So some textbook material will be covered in exams that is not covered in much detail in the lecture. So it's really important to address both of those components every week. Okay, so announcements and reminders. Your first homework is due this week, Sunday, at 11 p.m. You can access your homework in La Lima under the Assignments, Tests, and Surveys tabs. On to the course material. This is Lecture 1, Introduction to Brain and Behavior, and this corresponds to Chapter 1 of the textbook. I do want to note that I often record the introductory portion of the lecture separately from the course material part, so my voice might sound different based on my level of caffeination, and there might be different background noises. There's not always a very smooth transition either, so I apologize if that is distracting.
And chapter 1 was about the basics. So what is psychobiology? It's the study of the biological basis of emotion, cognition, and behavior. So essentially the biological basis of psychology. And I assume that most of you are interested, at least somewhat interested in psychology and the brain if you're taking these courses. But why study the brain? Because there are a lot of unanswered questions regarding the brain. We don't actually know that much about the brain, considering how much time and effort we've spent researching the brain. So scientists have only recently mapped the nervous system, or the entire brain and the rest of the nervous system of this C. elegans roundworm, which is a pretty small and simple organism. It only has 302 neurons and over 7,000 connections between the neurons. So it's a relatively small neural system, and only recently have we mapped this. Humans, on the other hand, have about 86 billion neurons with trillions of connections, indicating that we're quite a long way from understanding the complexity of the human brain. If you're interested in C. elegans and in this map that scientists have recently created, there's a website right here. So I'll refer a lot of times to websites and additional information in the lecture. You're not going to be responsible for that information, it's just if you're interested. And why study the brain as well? There are practical reasons. Many medical and psychological disorders originate in the brain. So for example, I study schizophrenia, and a big part of schizophrenia is observable changes that happen in the brain, dysregulation of dopamine, decreases in the volume of certain areas in the brain. And so we can learn a lot about treatments and causes of medical and psychological disorders by studying the brain. The nervous system is broken into a couple parts. There's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is what you think of, I think, when most people think of psychobiology or neuroscience. It's the brain and the spinal cord. And the spinal cord connects the brain to the rest of the body. In the peripheral nervous system, the periphery being like the outside part, right? So it's outside of the central nervous system. The nerves and this includes the nerves and the neuronal processes outside of the brain and spinal cord, and it's comprised of sensory and motor connections to and from the central nervous system. So it takes information from the body like touch, it takes information from the body like touch, brings it up to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system sends out information to complete actions. A neuron is a nerve cell within the body, within the nervous system, and neurons communicate with each other, and we're going to cover a lot of that in the second chapter. The cerebrum, which is also called the forebrain, is the main part of the brain. It's what you're used to seeing when you look at the picture of the brain, and it's responsible for most of our conscious thoughts. So it's responsible for these higher level functions. The brainstem is the lower center part of the brain, if you can see in this middle picture, this color part in the middle picture, and it includes the pons, medulla, midbrain, and diencephalon. Some people include the cerebellum in the brainstem, but this is more typically considered to be a separate component. So the brainstem is kind of like the old part of the brain. People call it like the reptilian part of the brain, meaning like it's, in terms of evolution, it was one of the first parts of the brain to evolve, so it's responsible for a lot of basic functions. And then the cerebellum which actually means like a little cerebrum. It looks like a tiny brain stuck in the back of the neck. And this plays a big part in learning and coordinating movements, has many connections with the cerebrum. And the cerebellum is actually a really interesting part of the brain. We're going to cover it a bit more in a later section, but we're finding out more and more that it plays a role in higher cognitive and emotional functions. Before, we often just considered it to be mostly responsible for movement, but we're learning that it's a little more complex than that. Section 2, Historical Perspectives on Brain and Behavior. Neuroscience and psychobiology have a long history in philosophy. So before people were really studying the brain, they were studying the brain directly necessarily. Before we had MRI and all these other neuroimaging techniques, philosophers like Aristotle were coming up with ideas of how they thought the brain and behavior connect. So Aristotle ascribed to a school of thought called mentalism, and he believed that the psyche, which is essentially there was a psyche, which is essentially the idea of the mind, untouchable, intangible entity that's responsible for conscious awareness and cognition. And mentalism is the idea that the mind is responsible for behavior, which to us is really, most people would consider that to be obvious now, but back in Aristotle's time that was not a given. It was a newer idea. Then many years later, Descartes, who was considered kind of the father of modern philosophy, came up with dualism. And dualism is the idea that the mind and the body are actually separate entities. So Descartes believed that the mind and the body interact through the pineal gland, which we now know is not correct. But he believed that there was a separate physical brain and mind, and they just happen to run parallel to each other. So the dualism, most people don't agree with dualism right now. Obviously, this entire course is built on the idea that dualism is not correct, that the mind and behavior, mind and the body are the same, that the mind is just the workings of the brain. And one problem with dualism is the mind-body problem, which is the difficulty of explaining how this non-material mind and a material body could interact. And dualists, there are modern dualists, and they've tried to kind of come up with explanations of that, but they're typically not satisfactory. And then later scientists and thinkers included Darwin, who was most famous for his theories of evolution, Mendel, who came up with some basic rules of genetics and how we inherit characteristics. And more recently, a lot of scientists have been very interested in epigenetics. So epigenetics is the observation that genes can be expressed in different ways depending on environmental influences. So depending on maybe if somebody has a genetic predisposition for a certain for obesity, these genes can be turned on or off based on things in the environment. All of these ideas also help us understand that all species are related, and therefore their brain and behavior must be related. So the brain and behavior of more complex species evolved from simpler species. A long time ago, we were a much simpler form of animal. Humans were a much simpler form of animal, and we sort of, as we evolved, we kind of left behind simpler forms of life. And then there's materialism, which is the idea that the brain and the nervous system are enough to explain behavior without having to talk about the mind. So this is the idea that it's not so much that the mind and the brain are the same thing, it's that there's no such thing as the mind and all we have is the brain, and that explains all of behavior. More about the modern brain and behavior perspectives, there's eliminative materialism, which is the idea that there's no need to talk of non-substance mental explanations of behavior if the behavior can be explained wholly by the nervous system. So it's a strong version of materialism within this belief, or within this idea of eliminative materialism. Beliefs and thoughts are just brain processes. So it's something that it's something physical that happens, physical and chemical that happens in the brain. And according to this belief, the more that we know about how the brain works, the less we'll have to depend on these kind of psychological phenomena such as depression, anxiety, things like this. And again, this is a very strong version of materialism. A lot of people have beliefs that are more somewhere along the spectrum of materialism. So most people who study the brain accept some form of materialism, but recognize that since we don't know everything about the brain, we have to use these kind of mental constructs like belief, pain, attention, depression, anxiety, etc. Okay, moving on to sections 3 and 4, evolution of the nervous system. The first brain cells evolved around 700,000 million years ago, which is a very long time ago. And the first brain, which is like a connection of brain cells, evolved around 250 million years ago. The modern human brain, as we know it, is relatively young, only 200,000 years old. Within the 5 kingdoms of organisms that you might remember from biology classes, only animals have nervous systems and muscles. So when we talk about the nervous system, we're talking only about animals. The simplest and earliest form of the nervous system was called the nerve net, and there are very simple organisms that still exist today that have a nerve net, which is essentially just throughout the body a kind of loose connection of nerve cells. So no centralized brain, just this sort of net of neurons throughout the body. And over time, nervous systems became increasingly more organized, complex, maybe localized, culminating with the modern human brain, which is the most complex nervous system. Humans are primates, and we evolved from the same ancestors as other apes that still exist. So we didn't necessarily evolve from apes that are existing, but we have common ancestors. In general, brain size is in proportion to body size increases with intelligence. So the bigger the proportion of your brain in relative to your body, the more intelligent as an organism. This isn't necessarily for people, but for species in general. Primates in general have good color vision. We're good at distinguishing color. We can see red and green distinctions, most of us can at least. We have forward-facing eyes that allow for depth perception and strong vision, so the visual system is particularly evolved to be strong in primate. The earliest remains from our genus, from the human genus Homo, were found in Ethiopia. And here's a picture of some of the earliest human remains. This is a jawbone at the bottom here. As the ancestors of humans evolved, brain size increased, particularly the size of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is this, literally the lobe that's in the front part of your brain, and it's associated with the most complex functions, executive functions we call them. So intelligence in humans is associated with the fact that our frontal lobe is bigger than a lot of other primates. And as our frontal lobes increased, the complexity of tools that we used also increased based on anthropological and archaeological findings. And so we can assume that as the frontal lobe increased, humans became more intelligent based on this kind of proxy measure of how complex the tools were that they were using. Modern humans, us, were Homo sapiens sapiens, appearing 200,000 years ago, which is relatively young in terms of the scale of how long animals and living organisms have been around. Neanderthals existed alongside modern humans and died out probably only 40,000 years ago. So there was quite a bit of time that Neanderthals and modern humans were existing side by side. There used to be kind of the belief that Neanderthals were really, really basic and not that intelligent or complex, but actually there's more and more indication that they were relatively complex and had like culture and language, religious beliefs, and there's actually some interesting findings that they had brain sizes that were the same or maybe even slightly larger than modern humans. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were more intelligent than modern humans, but it's just kind of interesting that they at least had comparable brain sizes. So the brain size ratio that I talked about before, the proportion, is called the encephalization quotient, which is the ratio of actual brain size to expected brain size based on the body of a given animal. So if you look at the graph on the right, there's this regression line, which is what you would expect the brain size of an animal to be based on its body size. So a dog and a raccoon, these are pretty close to what you would expect, kind of an average encephalization quotient. The farther above the trend line an animal falls, the more intelligent it tends to be. So you see monkeys and Homo sapiens there. They tend to be a little more intelligent. And the farther below the trend line an animal falls, the less intelligent it tends to be. So rhinos, kind of dumb. Moles, I guess pretty dumb for their body size. But this is a really rough estimate. This ratio is a really rough estimate, and so it's not the whole picture. There's also, excuse me, density of brain cells, density of neurons that have to be taken into account. So your brain could be, you could have two brains that were the same size, but one of them is denser and is packed with more neurons, and the denser brain would be associated with higher level of intelligence. So why did the humanoid brain get so large and densely packed? There are, obviously we don't know for sure, but there are a number of ideas. One could be a response to changing climates in East Africa. So the out of Africa theory is that modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, and even some versions before this, Homo erectus and Neanderthals, were originally in East Africa, so in this area around Ethiopia and Kenya. There's this big valley in that region where a lot of the oldest specimens of humans are found. And it's believed that changes in climate caused the first modern humans to leave Africa, and so they had to adapt to this changing environment that they were leaving. There are also evidence, like the larger the social group gets, the more cognitively complex an organism needs to be to keep track of all these social connections. And then a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is actually conducive to, or was conducive to, increasing in intelligence. You have to be able to remember, if you're a hunter, you have to be able to plan and problem solve and outsmart your prey. And if you're a gatherer, you have to remember where things are. You have to be able to identify different plants, figure out what's poisonous and what is not. And so a lot of these lifestyles may have selected for more intelligent Homo species. As well, it's believed that the discovery of fire and therefore the cooking of food might have made it possible to save food longer, allowing for greater caloric intake with less time devoted to finding food. So if you cook meat, it can stay longer, it can keep longer. As well, you don't have to spend as much time. Cooked food tends to be more easily digested, so you're not spending as much energy digesting food, and then less mastication or chewing. If your food is cooked, you don't have to chew as much, which allows for smaller jawbones, which allows for more room for the skull to grow, which might seem kind of far-fetched, but there's some indication that the more intelligent. Homos became the smaller the jaw size was. Changes in the skull shape also appears to allow for more blood flow to the brain. So there's something called neoteny, which is juvenile characteristics that are retained into adulthood that allow for greater periods of learning and development. So the idea with neoteny is that the longer an organism has its young in juvenile periods, kind of the more development can happen. So for humans, we have a really long developmental period. I mean, we're not considered adults until we're 18 years old, whereas a giraffe is born pretty much able to stand within a few minutes, immediately able to run away from prey. So this kind of prolonged period where someone is taking care of us when we're young allows for more cognitive functions and more complex learning and development. Kind of a sort of a version of neoteny, or maybe in contrast to neoteny, some people believe that we go through each stage of development, but these stages are just prolonged relative to other apes. So neoteny is more that that more intelligent species never go through these later developmental stages. And a contrasting viewpoint to that is that we do go through these stages, but they're just longer. Okay, so section 5, the modern human brain. So the question is, does size matter? So does the size of a brain of an individual matter? And the answer appears to be sometimes it matters, but not always. So larger brains are associated with higher IQs if a person's brain, for developmental reasons, is really, really small. So there are certain developmental disorders that retard the growth of the brain, and this is associated with a lower IQ. However, men, as compared to women, and larger people, just physically larger people, tend to also have larger brains, but this is not necessarily correlated with higher IQs. So there are some caveats to an association between brain size and intelligence in individuals. However, there are some factors that influence, some kind of like third factors that may influence an association between body size and IQ, like good nutrition. So if somebody has good nutrition, they're probably going to be taller, they're probably going to be larger, and they're probably going to have a higher IQ as well. Intelligence is also a really complicated construct. We have intelligence tests, but they're culturally biased, and they only measure one form of intelligence pretty much. They measure cognitive functions, but they don't measure emotional intelligence, they don't measure, some people would argue that athletic ability is a form of intelligence, like being able to perform complex motor skills is a form of intelligence. So the question of whether brain size correlates with intelligence can be kind of complicated. One really important aspect of the modern human brain is that it's plastic. Plasticity means a potential for change, chemical and physical change. So when you learn things, anytime you learn things, your brain is changing in structure, and this is plasticity. It's the ability of the brain to change in structure and function to adapt to the environment. And we will talk a bit more about brain plasticity in a later chapter as well. Compared to some other species, the modern human brain evolved relatively rapidly. And increasing complexity of the brain was associated with increasing complexity in culture. So just like how we saw increased area of the frontal lobe being associated with increased complexity in tools, we also see bigger brain, bigger frontal lobes, more complexity of the brain being associated with more complex culture. Culture being the learned behaviors and beliefs that are passed down from generation to generation. and there are indications of culture or some kind of like recording of daily life as early as like almost 40,000 years ago. So there are cave drawings in Indonesia, which is the oldest known figurative art, and this is as old as 35,000 years ago. This pig deer is about 35,000 years old, and there's a hand that appears to be about 40,000 years old. So the takeaway of this chapter in general is that the modern human brain is rather special. It's the most complex organ that we have. The human brain is the most complex out of any organism, and there's still a lot that we don't know about it. There's still a lot to be learned.